Recording in progress.
Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Tunde Olatunji. I'm the Associate Director of Policy at the Africa Center. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. And for those who have been with us for a program in the past, it's good to have you again. Before we get started today, just a bit about the Africa Center. We're a multidisciplinary institution engaged in work primarily in arts and culture, policy, and business. And we really are concerned primarily with narrative change about Africa. We think it's important what kind of information gets to shape our understanding of the place, and also who gets to shape our understanding of the place as well. And so as part of that work, we put on public programs such as this one, and we're happy to have you with us tonight. So our program this evening, Beyond Football, the Rise of African Football, will examine the history of the sport on the continent and its role in, I think, both shaping and reflecting the realities of the people that live there. And also we'll try to figure out why it has continued to matter so much to everyone on the continent, even as far as people who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves avid sports fans. And to help us with that today, we're joined by two speakers with a lot of experience on the issue. First, we have Sean Jacobs, who's an associate professor of international affairs at the New School. He has written about football for Roads and Kingdom, Al Jazeera, and the New York Times, and he runs a football podcast called 11 Named People. We're also joined by Dr. Hisham Aidi, pardon me. He's a senior lecturer at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and he's a co-founder of the program on African social research, and he has co-authored several books on football and has written about football for the New African and Africana magazines, among many others. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Tunde.
Great. Right. So to get started, I think it might be good to start from sort of bird's eye view of football on the continent and maybe get into more of the more complicated stuff. So we all know it's the most popular sport in the world. Its showcase of event, the World Cup, draws in a viewership of over 1 billion people, and it brings in revenue to the governing body of over $5 billion, I think was the number for the 2018 World Cup. This viewership is in contrast to the Super Bowl, by the way, which I think is about 120 million people, just to get a sense of that gulf. So if we could start, the last World Cup in 2022, if I could start with you, Sean. So for the first time in the history of the sport, we had an African country reach the semifinals of the World Cup. Morocco defeating Portugal in the quarterfinals. How significant a victory would you say this was, both I think in footballing terms and in terms of the growth of the sport in the continent? I'm sorry, I think I addressed that to you, Sean, but that's a lot more appropriately may be addressed to you, Hisham. So let's start there.
Yeah, for a second I was like, wow, man.
He felt disrespected.
Apologies.
I mean, I could talk quickly, and then Hisham will have the chance to.
No. I'll give.
Go ahead.
I'll give a brief thing. I'll just say, was this? So thank you, Tunde. Thank you, Nazareth, for putting this together. I'll say, yeah, it was significant. Obviously, Morocco's unexpected success. I would say, well, the first thing is soon after, Morocco was given the right to host the Mundialito, which I think is the first time it happens on the continent, which is the club's World Cups. And I guess if you perform well in the World Cup and you're seen to be a football mad country and your fans are well behaved, then they come and test your infrastructure. So they did the Mundialito, that went well. And soon thereafter, Morocco has advanced the candidacy along with Spain and Portugal for a World Cup in 2030, which I think would be very good for African football. What else was significant about Morocco's success? I'd say it put a spotlight on Morocco's position as a country between Africa and the Arabic-speaking world. The never-ending debate on whether North Africa is African or Arab, obviously both. It also sort of put a spotlight on particularly Moroccan debates about ethnicity, language, sort of different cultural wars that were playing out in Qatar stadiums. I just want to say that the reason Morocco was successful is not that we have better talent or that we're more football mad, is that the country, for two reasons, the success is really for two reasons. The government has invested heavily in football infrastructure, setting up a top-notch academy, the M6 Academy in Rabat. So that's one, setting up pitches around the country. And second, Morocco has been a pioneer in knowing how to tap diaspora networks, right? So Morocco and Turkey, sort of different bookends of the Mediterranean, have the largest diaspora populations in Europe per capita. And Morocco figured out a way. There are almost 3 million Moroccans in Europe, or 3.5. And they figured out a way, they lobbied FIFA. We can get into the details later, but they lobbied FIFA to change its rules so that kids, second generation Moroccans who grew up in Madrid or London or Amsterdam, who may have played for England or or Spain under 17, they lobbied FIFA to change the rules such that the foreign-born second generation Moroccans can play for the national team, right? And I think that was absolutely critical, right? And Morocco lobbying FIFA, and that has helped other African countries, so Tunisia, Senegal, and so on. And I do think, honestly, Senegal, I don't want to say had a stronger team, but they had as much of an opportunity to hit to reach the semifinals had Sadio Mane been. And Senegal is the most, well, we don't think of this often, but Senegal is the most represented country in terms of footballers in Europe, right? African footballers in Europe, it tends to be Senegal with about 65 to 70 players. Morocco's at 55, then Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Algeria, and so on. So that's my opening statement.
So I think that's great, and there's a lot of stuff in there that I think we'll touch on. But before we go on, Sean, just in terms of why this was significant, I imagine, yes, there's, well, how much benefit do you think there is to like the less tangible parts of this too? Just the bragging rights of being able to say an African country has gotten this far. Do you think there's any sort of significance to that, even though you can't really put that in the bank, so to speak?
No, there's a lot to that. I mean, I'll take a sort of longer view. The first African country to play in the World Cup was Egypt in 1934. And the reason for that was, and then for the next couple of World Cups, up until 1970, there was no African representation. And that's partly because colonialism, the World Cup was smaller. Africa had to qualify against so there's like one spot for Asia and Africa. And so there was no African representation up until 1970, to the 1970 World Cup, when incidentally it was Morocco again that went to that World Cup, so our first like representative. But the quick point is in 1966, Nkrumah led, and I think this is an important thing about that long view about the significance of what Morocco achieved. Nkrumah actually led like a sort of boycott movement saying, we will not participate in the 66 World Cup in England if we can't qualify directly. We don't want to do this route of qualifying against, us against Asia for this like one place. And so Africa got its one place. And so if you take the long view, as my point is, so gradually Africa was granted more places, two by one by 74, 78, and then two by 82, which is a significant World Cup, because that's when Cameroon actually didn't lose a game, but just because they drew, I think they drew 2 and 1-1, they just didn't make it. And Algeria got sort of cheated out by Germany and Austria colluding in a game. This is why we now have teams playing the last game at the same time. So there's cheating. And to just fast forward.
So do you mind really quickly taking us through that story about the collusion of the World Cup and why we have the third round of the group stage being played at the same time?
So basically, Algeria just needed I think Hisham can correct me on this, but Algeria needed to get this, they had won their game, if I'm not mistaken. And then the Germans and the Austrians, if one of them lost their game, they wouldn't go through to the next round. And so the two of them, they knew the result of Algeria's last game, and they played to this like, the adjective would be tepid. They played to this like boring game. Everybody watching it was just like, this is just, cheating. I mean, given all the words about cheating that we have in the West. But I want to jump forward and just mention 2 other quick things before I get to what Morocco achieved. So one is 1990 is a breakthrough year. That's when Cameroon goes to the World Cup, surprises everyone when they beat Argentina in the opening match. And everybody thinks, oh, that's a fluke. Remember, that's the Argentina Maradona. So everything, that's a fluke. And they managed to go to the quarterfinal, which if you watch the highlights of that game, they could have won that game. They just didn't understand that, what is it? Mourinho's parked the bus. They didn't know they should have parked the bus. So they lost the game. And so they made it to the quarterfinals. And then subsequently Ghana did the same in 2010. So that bogey sat on Africans like, can we go further than the quarterfinals? And I don't think, and Hisham can correct me about this, I know all this stuff about the academy, the investment, this creative use of the diaspora in football. I don't think people thought Morocco was going to be that team of 2022. I could be wrong about this. I think they did think it was Senegal, and nobody had much hope for any of the other African teams. I think people saw Morocco as like a dark horse, but they didn't really think it was going to be Morocco. And so, Morocco did. They did get this, and they almost went to the final. I think they were a little tired by then, but it's an incredible achievement, and it's. I don't think we will ever live it down. And I mean, Hisham mentioned all the other great things that came from what Morocco achieved. I think so. Beyond that, my last point quickly is, if you think of global football as these like power centers, so generally people think it's Europe and South America. What's actually interesting is that Africa would be like third. In terms of the kind of talent that Africa has, given the European leagues, the kind of footballers that have come out of Africa, George Weah winning the Ballon d'Or. I don't think has an Asian player won the Ballon d'Or yet? No. Drogba, players like running teams, if you want, the Chelsea under Mourinho, Sadio Mane at Liverpool. Sadio Mane leaves Liverpool kind of sort of falls apart. Yeah. So Africa is the third most important continent when it comes to football, bigger than CONCACAF, bigger than the Asian Football Federation. So there was always this question of like, can Africans win the World Cup? Can Africans actually go to the last 4? Can they go to the final? And all kinds of people made predictions. I think Pele became like a joke because Pele said Africa was going to win the World Cup. And sadly, Pele passed away. It didn't happen. So I think this World Cup just finally showed, if you kind of stay in the game, stay together as a team, have a positive kind of atmosphere around the team, the way the Moroccans brought the families of the players there, the way they, just like everything around that. I also think, and this is my quick last point, The fact that the World Cup was in Qatar, I think also contributed to that. A lot of people point out that it was easier to get there. If this World Cup was in Europe and the next World Cup is going to be in the US, it's harder for people from the African continent, the Arab world, to go to actual World Cup. So for that reason, I think it was almost like a perfect storm. I don't know if this will happen in the USA with the next World Cup, but for me, this World Cup was like a perfect storm. The table was set. And for once, I was very happy. An African team, beyond my expectations, they went to the semis. And this, I commend Morocco.
So I know you said to an extent, maybe people weren't expecting the performance of the Moroccan team, but I think it is fair to say, I think a number of players on that team have become or were household names at the time. And I wanted to speak to this idea of how African players have been considered throughout history, right? I think when George Weah did win the Ballon d'Or in '95, I think a lot of people saw that as like a breakthrough point for Africans in football, both in their exposure, but also in the way the world regarded them, right? So these are people that can play, right? And I wonder, Hisham, if you think from George Weah to today, if you think the stature or the level of recognition given to African players has sort of grown as well, and where are we today?
Yeah, good question. Let me just, I want to backtrack a little bit about what's called the disgrace of Gijón. This is when Germany and Austria colluded. So the lead up to that was Germany was going to play Algeria, and the Germans were very dismissive. A couple of players said they were going to play in tuxedos, a lot of racist language. And one German player said he was going to dedicate his 8th goal to his wife and the 9th goal to the dog, right? And then the Algerians beat Germany 2-1. And I guess Germanic nationalism surged, so they created this pact of non-aggression where they wouldn't score, where they agreed to a 1-1. And I think that moment is critical, not only because they changed the rules of the game, but also because we're going to be talking about sports diplomacy. Not all diplomacy succeeds, but a number of African states tried to lobby FIFA to replay the game because it was so obvious. People were screaming and shouting, que se besan, why don't they kiss? Why don't they just kiss? Because they're not going to score. But FIFA refused. And one reason they refused is that the number 2 is the head of the German Bundesliga. So there was a conflict of interest there, right? So you had these third world countries trying to push at this international organization, and they couldn't. But regarding George Weah, man, George Weah is so I'm of the generation of Maradona. Like Maradona is my demigod, right? But I remember when George Weah exploded, and we haven't had. I mean, we've had African players nominated, but not since have we had an African-born player. I thought Michael Essien would get it. I think 06, 07. But they gave it to Cannavaro. So has African football changed since? I mean, now I think almost 10%, I think 7% of the players in European leagues are African. There are some enormous figures, critical figures, but the brain drain, if you will, the brawn drain, the talent drain continues. So some things haven't changed. I mean, since George Weah won in '95. So yeah, let me backtrack a little bit. I grew up in northern Morocco, right across from Spain. So I grew up watching La Liga, obsessed with La Liga. And I remember those days, the only African players in Europe were Bruce Gobler, if he counts, at Liverpool, Mohamed Timoumi, Krimo, a handful of not that many, right? But when they changed the Bosman law, 1995, which used to be a limit on three foreigners, all of a sudden, literally, I mean, we're so close to Spain, people can cross over back then on a jet ski, right? So suddenly there was an out-migration of talent, of people who are going to try their luck with second division Portuguese, Spanish teams. So somebody should write on the role of the football dream and these young players who want to make it to Europe. You know, every time I see images of Lampedusa or bodies washing up in southern Spain. Every now and then, you'll see someone in a Barça shirt or an Atletico de Madrid shirt, right? So the dream of football, of that captivates so much young African talent. So there was an absolute drain of talent, right?
Yeah.
It happened through, voluntary, I guess, migration or economic refugees, but also scouting, right? Enormous scouting throughout the continent.
So I think, sorry, just not to cut. I think that's going to be a big part of what we discuss next. And I want to, before we go into that, and especially this idea of the brain drain, I want to stick with this idea of how African players are regarded, right? So I think, let's take George Weah, for example. I don't know that there is appropriate lore surrounding the pair. Like I don't think I could speak to friends of mine who really, really love football and they could tell me about his style of play. I think there was something about the way we regarded African players and what they were capable of physically on the field. And I wonder today, Sean, the way we think about, even as recently as Michael Essien, right? And the kinds of positions that we thought African players could play and what they couldn't play, and sort of the profile of the African player have our minds opened up to the idea of different kinds of African players? So maybe not just the destroyer, so to speak, or the center back. Are we able to process the idea of like our creative African player, right? Why has that been so difficult to penetrate our mindsets?
Before I answer that, I just want to quickly add to some stuff Hisham said, which is, so we should not forget that actually it was not unusual. There's a long history of North African, I don't like the distinction, but of like players from Algeria, Morocco, etc., Tunisia in France. There's like a longer history of that. There's also a longer history of players from French-speaking West African countries playing in France. So there's that history, right? There's also after 82, a lot of that team from Cameroon, many of those players actually ended up in Europe. I was just checking now. Thomas Nkona, who's like one of my favorite players, was an Espanyol. You probably were watching him on TV, Hisham. So like a lot of those. I think 82. In 82, he's already at Espanyol. So right after that World Cup. So there's historically in France. There's in Spain, and then one of my favorite players, Raba Majer, who's at like Porto with the back heel goal. Go Google it if you're not as old as I am. I think it's 86 or 87 for Porto. I don't want to tell people that another South African was the later hero of Porto, but I let that go. The point is, to your question about how do we regard African footballers, you're right. There's this kind of stereotype of central midfielder, defensive player. Like I think I'm thinking of who was he? The guy who played at Real Madrid from Mali. The big guy. There's
not so the his
I forgot his name.
The Makelele of Real Madrid. I don't know why.
Real Madrid, but there was a Malian, I think, who was playing at Real Madrid, like big dude. And this is like even Yaya Toure complains that Pep had that idea of black players, that black players was brawn, black players in that sort of central defensive kind of very defensive play, like breaking up plays. Essien, as you're right, is a sort of was seen as the embodiment of that. I will say this though, there's a couple of things that I think there's a couple of like moments or people who should get some credit for this. I think for changing some of that. I think Arsenal's, when Arsenal hired Kanu, and I'll get the date wrong, I think it's like 2000, 2001 or something. And Kanu is basically like the playmaker of that great team, right? That team that wins the Premier League, that has a perfect season. They also, and you have players there that are in defense, Kolo Toure, later on, Ebuye. Gervinho doesn't really do that well there. But I like the idea that Arsene Wenger, he has a role. He's actually the one who brings George Weah to Monaco. So there's his role in, I think, changing some of that in Europe's kind of big and important leagues. I think secondly, a guy who doesn't get his credit, and it's around the same time, sort of a little bit earlier, is what was his name again? Pape Diouf, who was the president of Marseille. I think Drogba, a whole bunch of, he got to Marseille after that team that won the European, what then becomes the Champions League. You know, the team of the Ayew brothers, their father, Pele Ayew, or whatever. So their dad, that team, but subsequent to that team, there's the Senegalese who becomes the president of Marseille, and a lot of African players pass through there, and they play not in those, as you point out, those like conventional kind of doorstopper football. And then I think, ironically, Mourinho, I think people forget Mourinho's role at Porto in the way that he elevated African players to, and I was talking there about Benny McCarthy, who was a creative forward. And if you look later when he goes to Chelsea, you mentioned Essien, Mikel Obi, Drogba, like at the heart of his teams, like taking responsibility, almost if you want, like becoming the decision makers, the leaders of the team. So it might be true that I don't know. I have a sense that a lot of this has changed. I also watch a lot of Serie A. I watch too much football. But if you look at Serie A, you look at Napoli, you have Osimhen, you have I forget his name now, you have like a midfielder who's from Cameroon. There's just like, I think football has opened up to the idea. Morocco has Ziyech as this kind of playmaker, although he's in the Chelsea team. So I think for me, I mean, there's such a bigger answer, and I'm just mentioning some anecdotes, but I think if you look, I'm sort of trying to think that I think there are these markers. Arsenal, what Arsenal does under Wenger, what Mourinho does, changes that. I even think that Klopp, not to give Klopp too much credit, but I think Klopp also changes some of how we think about African players. Naby Keita, Sadio Mane. So for me, I don't think it's the same anymore. I think there's a lot more players in Italy, players in France. I think things have changed a bit from my perspective.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me, and I think there's probably a small piece that has to do with who is allowed on TV to talk about football and the way that they do and are able to speak about African players that maybe others might have been reluctant to. I want to go bigger picture, Hisham, and talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have. The continent has developed its own love for the sport, right? So we have our own heroes, we have our own stories, we have our own things to talk about, but it does seem to me that there is still probably some vestiges of the colonial presence that kind of brought it here. And I wonder how you think that manifests and why that's a bad thing, right? Because this is my favorite sport in the world, and I'm waking up every week. We were talking about this earlier. I'm waking up every week to watch British teams play each other, right? And so there's, as much as I love the Nigerian national team, why is this the case for myself? And I think so many people in Nigeria and on the continent. And is it a big deal? Am I overthinking
it? You're not overthinking it. It's good to overthink. Let me just say regarding the stereotype of the African player as a destroyer, you called it. I think JJ Okocha put a dagger in that. Just a brilliant playmaker. Same with Samuel Eto'o, also very creative striker. I mean, these people were they were really freestyling. It was just an extraordinary independence, improvisational, style of play. Regarding colonialism, man, the story goes back to the 1860s. Football comes to Africa with colonialism. Peter Allegri says the first registered game is South Africa, 1860s. Others say Egypt, 1860s. Either way, it was the Brits who brought. And there's an interesting literature on how where you had settler colonialism, elite settler colonialism, they brought cricket and rugby. But where you had merchants and sailors and missionaries, you got football, right? So the story, I mean, there's so much to say on football and colonialism. I mean, I think my favorite story is regarding the FLN of Algeria. How you had, as mentioned earlier, I mean, Algeria was a département, part of France. So you had about six players who were slated to play in the 1958 World Cup. And they disappeared, convened in Tunis, and decided to play for L'Équipe FLN, for the Algerian National Liberation Front, right? Boycotting France. France lobbies, so it condemns them to 6 years in prison. in absentia, and then lobbies FIFA so that no FIFA team can play against the FLN team. So the FLN team goes to play behind the Iron Curtain, if you will, right? So they went to the non-aligned states. They played Vietnam, they played Yugoslavia, and they would receive recognition as representatives of Algeria. So here you had football playing a role in gaining at least juridical sovereignty for Algeria. I mean, colonialists were plundering the continent for talent for, since the 20s and 30s. People like Larbi bin Barek of Morocco, Eusebio in Mozambique. What else is there to say about colonial? I mean, the ties remain. I sometimes think that the countries that have the strongest ties to their former colonizers often get better trade agreements in terms of which players they can use and so on, right? So
that's interesting.
I mean, if you look at Senegal, Morocco, I mean, these are countries that have, and I mean, Morocco is, Spain and France are former colonizers, right? So now you have the academy in Rabat. It has strong ties to Sevilla and Malaga, right? Where kids can go play there and so on. So, I mean, these ties remain, and Sean mentioned earlier the role of Kwame Nkrumah in lobbying, right? So there were multiple incidents of this, right? So he lobbies, he organizes 15 countries to get a slot. You get African states lobbying to isolate South Africa during the apartheid era. And, so some political science here, but you have geopolitics playing out in FIFA, with the great powers instrumentalizing FIFA and the third world countries trying to create some sort of solidarity bloc.
So
I wanted to quickly
if you want to jump in, yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's terrible that okay. So I'll say this quickly. There are some countries that are exceptional in that story of like, what are you watching? How you watch football every weekend. So I would say probably Morocco, Egypt, Algeria has that its own like strong club cultures. Like, and I'm not saying that there aren't very strong club cultures in West Africa, but they've maintained like the investment in how rich those teams are, the kind of players they can get. Because remember, they dominated for a while in these kind of continental competitions. So the CAF competitions, the CAF equivalent of the Champions League and Europa. I think the Europa one is called like a Confederations Cup. So that's true for North Africa. That's also true for Southern Africa, for South Africa. South Africa has a Premier League that is really, it's rich. I mean, it has like sponsorships, money, players get paid salaries that you don't, unless you go to like one of the top 5 leagues in Europe, you don't actually want to go play in Belgium or Norway, which is what probably lots of like a lot of Nigerian, Ivorian, Ghanaian players will do, go play in like Romania or something. You don't have to do that when you come from South Africa or when you come from the leagues that I mentioned, Morocco, Algeria, or Egypt. So that stuff is on television. If you have, and again, I know more about like SuperSport, the role of SuperSport. If you live in English-speaking African countries, you can actually watch SuperSport. SuperSport, for a while, actually did broadcast Nigerian football. It tried to broadcast the Zambian leagues, but it still only broadcasts, I would say, the PSL, and then it does all the African continental competitions. And by the way, you can watch the African continental competitions on YouTube. You can stream them. I do that. If you get beIN Sports, which is to go back to the Qatar role in all this game, if you got beIN Sport, you can watch the Champions League of Africa. I watch Sundowns. So Mamelodi Sundowns, the great team from South Africa, I think is like right now even dominating Al Ahly and Zamalek. Orlando Pirates, my team, I can follow them on beIN Sports. I'm hoping and wishing for this day when I can watch the PSL, the Premier Soccer League, on one of these satellite channels from my house in Brooklyn. So I think, yes, there's an imbalance because of the legacy of colonialism, and we're made, to sort of like pledge allegiance to these European teams. At the same time, hey, they have our players. I'm entitled to have an affinity for those teams. I think, and number 2, they become global clubs. If they were at one point tied to some town in the middle of England or the industrial north, like Manchester or Liverpool, and they were these local clubs with local loyalties tied to these like local, or whatever you think of Italy, Sampdoria, or Fiorentina, Napoli. I like Napoli, Maradona, to Hisham's earlier point, another Maradona guy. So they have our players. I also think it's like they were the strongest leagues. It also had to do with television. People forget that the first club, I don't know what it was like maybe in Morocco, but in the world I came up in, the first club that people saw on television, match of the day, or this one game on a weekend, and then later on this kind of European games on weeknights, were English clubs, and it was actually Liverpool. So television, I mean, like the kind of the rise of sort of global television.
Right.
So yes, there's this thing about colonialism, but I think there's also, I think I'm entitled to watch the English Premier League. They have
I think that's a fair point. I think that dynamic is complicated a tiny bit by, I think, what Hisham had brought up earlier, which is this idea of football brain drain. I want to bring you back in. So I think it's complicated when it doesn't feel as though, well, it feels exploitative to a degree. Then I think it makes consuming all this content feel less pure in your heart, right? As ridiculous as that might sound. And I'm wondering,
just before you go on, I mean, it's also like how we claim if France wins the World Cup, Africans will claim that victory. Because
so I think that's my very next question.
Yeah,
I think it's important.
Whose parents give their blood and sweat to France, but France don't want them. So we will celebrate their victories and their struggles. The same if Portugal wins the European Cup, we will celebrate it as our victory because it's our players that are in their teams.
But you don't see an issue with players having to make that decision simply to pursue their dreams. You don't think there's, I want us to kind of address some of the systemic stuff that leads to players feeling like, I need to move from Morocco to Spain if I have any chance of truly fulfilling the full extent of my football potential. So Hisham, I'm wondering, this football brain drain idea, I think there's one side of it which is very clearly, there are economic pressures that are making it so that talented Africans are having to leave Africa to play football. But I also think there's another identity piece to it, which is, do we delegitimize the experiences and identities of these French Africans and these players who do feel affinity to this place? And how do you disentangle that? It feels really complicated to come out understanding who the good guys in a thing like this is and how you perform your point of view in this kind of thing. It's not a good question, but help me out here.
I just thought of a piece that Timothy Garton Ash, who is hardly never associate him with football. He's all about NATO and Oxford and liberalism and so on. And during the 2006 World Cup, he went through the French suburbs, the ghetto, the banlieue, asking African kids, who are you rooting for? All right. So football is a very interesting way to get at people's attachments and identity and so on. Will you root for France that plays against Senegal? If France plays Algeria, if France plays against Congo, whose side are you on? If the US plays Mexico and you're Mexican American, who are you going to root for? That kind of thing. There's a lot to say about the Africans who play in Europe. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the '98 World Cup, where the far right denounced the team for not being French because it was made up of North Africans and West Africans, to later the team being completely embraced and leading to like all kinds of pop cultural trends. Suddenly you're getting a fusion of North African music and and so on.
Can I ask something about that specifically though? How do we process that? Are we cynical about that, or do we see that as evidence of football doing this magical thing that we say it's able to do, right, of changing hearts and minds? Or do we see that as you guys use these people and now that they performed in a way that makes you happy, they're finally people to you, right? Is that how are we supposed to process that? What's
Yeah.
the right way?
Yeah. Let me answer it like this. First thing, Simon Cooper's written about this, I think. Why do these second generation players choose to play for the home country? Often, I mean, he said to please their parents. I think it's more complicated. I think you get a lot more love, you know, in the home country when you come back to Morocco and you're doing a parade. As opposed, there's some very interesting work right now being done by Paul Silverstein, how over the last 10 years, given the Islamophobia in France, the national team is becoming progressively less North African, particularly with the affair Benzema. How he says Algeria is my real country, and Deschamps will not play him no matter what, right? So a number of players so the Zidane generation chose to play for France. These kids coming up today, with the new infrastructure, they'll play for Algeria and Morocco. Riyad Mahrez could have played for France, right? He chose to play for Algeria. So the rise of the far right is also pushing players in that decision. But I'll answer your final question like this. I have two friends, scholars, football heads. I remember the 2018 final, Croatia versus France, right? I'm on the French side. It's an African team, right? My friend, Zach Mampili, who we know, he says, how can I support a team, you know, a right-wing government, you know, was it Sarkozy or whoever it was, you have a French government that's wreaking havoc on Africa and suddenly is elevating these players. He says, it's like Trump and suddenly you have a team of Mexicans, right? I can't support that when you have this xenophobic anti-immigrant government and that's putting up this team of tokenistic players, a token team. On the other side, Marwan, a sociologist who's a big football head, said there is something, football is a public good and it brings joy, right? These communities deserve joy. These unrespected, unrecognized, excluded communities, when they win, they feel seen, they feel respected. Mbappe brings joy. So for that reason, I support the French team. And I would say myself, I think just to have these minority communities finally feeling represented and included, and I think it leads to a rough and tumble cultural integration among the youth. It doesn't change policies necessarily at the government level. You're still, today is a French politician who wants to rename a high school that's named after Angela Davis. They're going to rename it because she came out in support of minority communities in France and so on. So I don't think football will change that, but it breaks down barriers, I think, between different communities on the ground.
Sean?
I mean, for me, I think you have to think about it in terms of the ideal. So like one of my favorite quotes is by the historian Eric Hobsbawm, who said that the imagined community of millions seem more real as a team of 11 named people. So that's that is basically what Hisham was trying to, part of what I think Hisham was sort of getting at, which is it's less about kind of like what the country is, who the country is at that point, and sort of the idealism that football kind of evokes in people. So for example, I mean, lots of people probably when they were watching the World Cup, Saudi Arabia gets on the field with Argentina, and they have all kinds of, MBS, the Saudis are this, the Saudis are that. I bet you I was shouting for the Saudi national team. Because that's in that moment, it's the underdog, it's about the people. I think the problem often with football is, and football is full of those contradictions. If you pick the team based purely on sort of like, that is, those players are from country X, you are sort of like, I think sometimes one flattens out, like what are like the desires, the kind of, what is it that those, if I grew up in a banlieue in Paris, and Hisham actually brought up a really good point, which is I've also noticed this, like more recently, you're like, where are all the nominally Arab players, Arab French players in the French national team? That really has declined. It's basically now a team of kind of mostly Antilleans, guys from the Caribbean, and players whose parents are from like West Africa, Angola even now. Kamavinga, his family comes from Angola. So that is an issue, but I think at the same time, you have to think about it more. The only way for me that it makes sense is this way that Hobsbawm talks about it. It's this kind of, it's an organic idea. Right now, the national team, when it comes to football, it's a sort of organic idea of the nation. And I'm thinking of one other quote, and I'll stop, which is C.L.R. James, who wrote about cricket, And people like to quote him about like, what do they of cricket? You know, that thing that people like to quote. But he had another, in that same book, he wrote and said, West Indians, and it's about cricket, right? Because remember the islands, they together, they formed one cricket team that then competed against England and Australia and so on. And he said, West Indians crowding to test, bring with them the whole history and the future hopes of the islands. And if you know cricket, I mean, I'm from South Africa, right? From the mid-1970s until the early 1990s, there's a great film called Fire in Babylon about the West Indian cricket team. They dominated. Now, I'm growing up in South Africa, where the white people are the only people who are playing for the national team or playing in the elite level of cricket in the provinces. Who do you think we're shouting for? The West Indian cricket team.
Yeah.
So I think there's something about sport, like, you know, and I don't think at that point the West Indies was like full of like very conservative puppet governments supporting like the US, you know, doing the US's bidding in the Caribbean. But that wasn't the people. That wasn't Clive Lloyd and Viv Richards. That wasn't the players. And I would say, for me, I would argue that that's how I think of French, you know, black and brown players who play for France, who play for England. They have I think that's their country. You know, they struggle to create some kind of humanity in that place. And for me, I'm sort of like trying to honor, like, okay, they're in that team. And at some other level, I'm like also, and they're carrying all the dreams of those of us who couldn't make it to that tournament. Those, I don't mean me, I mean our countries. Like South Africa can't be in the tournament. So I mean me. Yes, that looks like it. Huh? It's like the same. Well, it's a different thing with the thing about Morocco, with how Morocco did in this World Cup is you don't need France in that moment. You have Morocco. Like that was what's so great. Was great about Morocco's run in the World Cup is that you didn't have to do all that other work of like, oh, I gotta support. Am I gonna support France? Am I gonna, you know, Zach's kind of struggle. Like, can I? No, you could support Morocco, bro. To Morocco for this one.
So yeah, I think that is. I have one more. I want us to go into some more of the economic implications of just an entire generation of African players that now really do have means at a level that I don't think has been available to an African athlete throughout history. But before we move on from that, just on this idea of identity and how we like to insist that these French players are actually African. And I think the part that gives me pause, I think, is considering that these players, they continue to live lives outside of football, right? So if us, even though well-intentioned and well-meaning, are challenging their place in these societies that they still live in, and these battles that they're having to keep doing on a daily basis in social and political scenes, and we are coming in trying to help, but also adding to this idea that you're not really French, I think is a little, I think it gets problematic, because while our intentions are, you know, as fans of the sport and of this place, I think they're personal political identity-based considerations that come into play when we sort of insist on people being who we think we want them to be, you know? But anyway, for to this idea of economic means. So I think there's this new, there's an ability that now exists for really a lot of these world-class athletes to significantly affect the situations that they come from and that they're in. And I think that's the same for everyone around the world. And I think there's an extent to which it happens or matters in Africa, where you have these players who really have gone and have been able to, and a lot of them have made truly transformational contributions to the places. I'm thinking along the lines of Sadio Mane, who went home and has just done incredible things for his communities, built hospitals, schools. Mo Salah does a lot of work. And my question for you, Hisham, is I think my immediate response to this is good. Yes, fantastic change is happening. But do we get to a point where the line between, well, this is maybe unfair, but how much of this should be on the shoulders of these players? I know in Africa there's a lot of talk about what shouldn't be versus reality. But again, in the long run, should they be as involved? Should these players be trying to be as involved in these social issues as they are, or should we be looking to have them not have to do this to an extent, right? The German football players are not having to have opinions on all these really important things. They're able to just live their lives as rich people who are really good at this sport, right? And I wonder how does this play in, and are we asking too much?
Look, you have countries that are investing heavily in football, but that are, it's controversial if you're putting $100 million into a footballing academy, but there are no hospitals in the area, or no factories, no jobs in the area, right? So these countries are cash-strapped, and which is why they're still dependent on Western states. Now, Sadio Mane has done great work. Mo Salah, a number, Ushuala in Nigeria, she set up the Lagos Academy. There are a number of
Drogba's
others.
done phenomenal work as well.
She Football Initiative as well, so they've done incredible, but I think there are limits to philanthro capitalism, as it's called, where, if you have mass inequality, the solution is not Warren Buffett giving away whatever. You need the state to step in and whatever, through taxation or whatever it may be, invest in this sector. I think what I find interesting is how Europe has declined in so many ways. The EU is really no longer. EU is Europe is declining, and and Russia is surging, and you have the far right, and yet Europe today is a footballing powerhouse, right? And it's European cities that have the best soccer academies, right? I think Vox did a story and it's Paris is #1, followed by Sao Paulo, Brazil, and then London, Amsterdam, and Madrid. And I follow Spanish soccer, so I've been to Madrid. Just Real Madrid has 11 pitches, right? Just for its junior academy, right? That kind of state capacity, even the South African league is rich. That kind of state capacity is just not available on the continent, right? So this is not Atletico Madrid, it's not Valladolid, it's just Real, right? 11 pitches, and kids to under 12, under 13 move through the system. They go from Cantera 1, Cantera 2, Las Rosas to Castilla, and eventually to the Bernabeu, right? That's what the dream is supposed to be. And they used to recruit from Africa. They had scouts all over the world in Latin America, but FIFA passed an amendment, I think, Amendment 19 in 2001, restricting, you can't bring under 16s, kids under 16 to Europe, and often they don't get to play for Barca, and they end up jobless and so on. So FIFA tried to regulate this, right? But what it led to is a weird kind of outsourcing, where Atletico Madrid sets up a school in Casablanca. Salzburg, an Austrian team, has an academy in Mali. Metz has an academy in Dakar. They claim they, quote unquote, discovered Sadio Mane and Koulibaly and so on. And there's a big debate around this feeder system, right? Because on the one hand, yeah, it is. They're plundering talent and so on. But on the other, a lot of people say, I wouldn't have an opportunity. There'd be no, Sadio Mane may not have broken through were it not for this European school here. And I think Arsene Wenger came out a few years ago and defended these schools, I don't know what to call them, subsidiary outsourcing schools.
I think they call them academies, don't they?
Academies, yeah. He defended them, saying that if Kylian Mbappe were born in Cameroon, he would not be the superstar that he is today, because Africa doesn't have the infrastructure. And I remember that being significant, because I didn't think he'd say something like this. But I remember the critique came from CONMEBOL. It didn't come from CAF. It didn't come from the African Federation. It came from Latin America that called them colonial and arrogant and so on. So God bless the decolonial thinkers of Latin America for responding. But so there are these schools set up by clubs, but there's a huge Moroccan migration on Holland, for instance, that in Morocco, you have Ajax school set up by people affiliated with Ajax, for instance, right? So there are a lot of these schools, and I mean, there's a lot more work I think that needs to be done around here. And, just a final point about this. If you look at Real Madrid again, study after study has shown that kids recruited from the Real Madrid vicinity rather than brought in. So FIFA puts in a regulation, you can't recruit under 16s from overseas unless their parents come along and the parents have jobs, like Messi, right? So they start recruiting locally, and the studies, apparently they claim that students recruited from the immediate suburb do better, who are Madrid born do much better than students brought from overseas, right? For I guess for understandable reasons, they have a community and so on. But now what you have is kids like Ashraf Hakimi. He's from Madrid, right? So he went up through the system, but he can displace somebody who grows up in Morocco now, right? If he chooses to play, he chose to play for Morocco instead of Spain. But obviously, with all the science and technology and capacity and investment they invested in him, he'll get first place as opposed to a kid who grew up in Marrakesh or whatever. So I sometimes think that in FIFA, in Morocco, having FIFA change its rules, it's leading to redistribution of resources. Ziyech can play back home and so on. But on the other hand, you're seeing that these kids who go to these top academies in Barca can displace, take a slot from a kid raised in Cameroon or whatever.
Yeah. I think that's really, really important. And I want to pause. I have one more question I want to go through, but I want to see if we have any questions from the audience that we can take before we get into that.
There's a question by somebody, actually.
Oh, great. Let me see. Questions. Oh, you want to just, you guys can also just read it.
I can read it. It says, thank you for the wonderful discussion. My question has to do with earlier discussion surrounding the importance of George Weah, his career, and the impact of him winning the Ballon d'Or on the image of African players. Why do you not hear as much about Eusebio's Ballon d'Or in 1965 compared to that of Weah in this regard? I have a sense that this is part of the legacy of the colonial brain drain and assimilationist projects that you all have spoken about. But I'm curious why there is this law around Weah as such a marker for African football and not for Eusebio. I get the sense that there's a tension within African sport that writers and researchers pay special attention to. As a parallel, the Olympic medal of the great Algerian runner Bouguera Al-Wafi and Alain Mimoun, I'm probably butchering their names, are both in the ledgers for France rather than Algeria, and they are rarely talked about as the founders of African distance running.
I think that's really interesting. Do either of you want to tackle that? Tackle that one? Thank you for that wonderful question. By the way, yeah.
I mean,
so
I'll give a short, and then I think Hisham's smiling because I think he has an answer. So my short answer would be Eusebio played for Portugal. I think there was no at that point. I mean, as I was trying to say earlier, African countries, so CAF gets formed, I think in you can, I don't know if you have a fact check here, but it's in the late 50s, I think 56 or something. And there's only 4 countries at the founding: Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt, and ironically, South Africa, who wants to play with a white team. But in any case, they get expelled, by the way, for that. Thanks, CAF, for doing that noble act from the beginning. But in any case, so he goes to play in Portugal. So he has to play for the Portuguese national team, which, by the way, there's a character that I'm currently sort of fascinated by. There's a guy from Johannesburg in South Africa called Abraham Julius, who goes to play in Lorenzo Marques, then the Portuguese colony of Mozambique, that becomes Mozambique. And he is, by South African standards, he would be called mixed race or colored. And he goes and plays in that league. And this is the funny story. He's seen by a scout, a Portuguese scout, and he ends up in Portugal playing for Sporting. And then a couple of years, I think 1 or 2 years after he's in Portugal, he becomes a citizen of Portugal, changes his name to Davi Julio, and he plays in the Portuguese national team. Go Google this if you think I'm lying. And he also wins. And so this gets to the point. Actually, now I'm answering this guy's question. This gets to this. He actually wins the equivalent of what is now the Europa League. And if you're in South Africa, people will say Benny McCarthy, this is sort of South African baseball, insider baseball. Benny McCarthy is the only winner of a European championship because he won it with Porto, with Mourinho in 2004. And nobody says David Julio had won this thing with Sporting. And I think from my perspective, I don't think there's a sort of like dismissal of Eusebio's achievement. I think Africans laud Eusebio, like they praise him to no end. And when he died, I think there was an outpouring across the continent. Older people remember how great he was in that '66 World Cup. I think they went to the quarterfinals. He was incredible. I think he won the Golden Boot in that World Cup too. So people know how wonderful he was, but they also, I think it's more to do with that point about stats and about the Algerian runners. I think in the end, it becomes about nominally, who were you representing at that point? So in the sort of talk about football, I think regularly people, Eusebio was the pioneer, the first kind of global, actually that's the phrase people use, the first global African football star was Eusebio. There's those, Bala and, Narbi and them, all those players did exist. But the truth is, like, the first player to be a global superstar who came from Africa was Eusebio. People know that, people say that, but when it comes to like holding records and things like that, they are going to look like who was he representing? He was representing Portugal. George Weah was representing an African country, Liberia, and I think for that reason, I don't think there's any nefarious. I love Eusebio as much as I love George Weah. But when it comes to being accurate about stats, people will say George Weah.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Hisham, thoughts?
But do you love Eusebio as much as you love Maradona? That's the question.
No.
So that's another piece of this, which I think is there's a significant marketing piece that I think plays into how much we remember players and their achievements. And I think that also comes with the countries that they're from and their ability to sell you on the idea that this is the greatest player of all time. And I think for a lot of African players, it's just that infrastructure does not exist.
Yeah, no, I'll say I went to the Eusebio Museum in Lisbon, and it's beautiful. And I mean, we need an Eusebio documentary. We need a Netflix documentary about him. I love Maradona and Pele, but they're over-researched, or maybe I shouldn't say that, but I mean, there are a number of figures that need.
There's too much about them already. Yeah.
There's an enormous amount. So we need something on. I mean, I just found out recently that Gil Scott Heron's father, was the first Black player to play for Celtic in Scotland. Right, he was a Jamaican international. He played for Scotland. He was a poet. He has a book of poetry. He died in 2008, and his granddaughter lives in the city, and she plays soccer. Right.
Gil Scott Heron's dad played.
Yeah. Absolutely. Played in Scotland.
Played in Scotland, absolutely. And I think he was a multi-athlete. I think he played other sports as well. But anyhow, no, there are these. I mean, not the greatest. I mean, I don't know if we should. This is complicated, right? So
he also gets written out of sort of the American story about soccer, which is to make it this kind of white. It very much gets told as like a white sport, when in fact, as you like the point you used, just giving him as an example, he is like the significant Black player from the U.S. who was to play in like a top league in Europe at the time. Yeah, sorry.
No, he lived in Detroit for many years, so he's very American. He played for Detroit. He played for Chicago after coming back from Scotland. Another figure that's interesting is Just Fontaine, I guess a French settler, or who was born in Marrakesh, but in 1958 World Cup, he's still the highest scoring striker in the World Cup. 13 goals in one World Cup, 1958. Right?
I think I knew that either.
Who claims him? Should the French claim him? Should the Moroccans claim him? And so Eusebio played when Mozambique gained independence, 1975, right? So Mozambique wasn't an independent nation then, so he gets to be folded into the Portuguese record.
So I think that's I really like that question because I think it ties into this question of narrative, which I want to see if we can maybe close on before I ask your final thoughts on what policy recommendations to fix African. Just a quick 2-sentence one. No, but this question about narratives, and I think the narratives around football on the continent or the players or whatever. And I want to talk about this idea of corruption. And I think I don't know if you saw that FIFA documentary that came out on Netflix about the scandals that go in, and you can see that a lot of the mismanagement and just poorly runness of FIFA comes down to like some pretty blatant corruption. And I think the corruption is on from their end to a lot of footballing bodies in Africa and the Caribbean, and sort of that pipeline of just here's bribes and we'll assume that you're using it to build for facilities, but we don't care. But I think so that was when all this stuff came out. I think it was easy to sell and easy to understand when you just have the story be FIFA allocated money to African football bodies, that money got misappropriated. That fits into our understanding of governance in Africa and how things can go awry. But I think then you watch that and you see that there's a lot more corruption has nothing to do with these African countries, and FIFA at its head at the top is fully rotten. But how do we, I guess the question, let me come to the question here, is how do we get out of, to what extent do you think Africa is trapped in this prison of stereotypes? Like we've talked about it in terms of players and what players can do, but I think African football as a whole, I think there's this sense that the things that are wrong are internal. But could you explain why that's not true? As far as there's instances of corruption in the way the money is handled, but I think there's some fundamental inequities in the way football is run around the world that I think leads to a lot of the disparities that we see. Could you maybe speak to that more?
Oh my.
Lars?
I'll say two things. You know, one thing, so the way privatization, commercialization, globalization, sort of the power of the market, the private sector is affecting football is incredible, right? Just as in any other sector, the private sector there's a certain rapaciousness, there's a predatory capitalism that's playing out in football as well. I find it really interesting that, you know, the schools that I was mentioning in Madrid, they're literally called La Fábrica, the factory, right? And they say they produce jugador global, a global player, right? They're not producing specialized players, right? They're producing a player, you drop them off in a country that plays tiki-taka, they can play. You drop them off in the catenaccio in Italy, they can play. I just find that interesting because it sounds like academia today, where we don't want specialists, we want generalists, right? It's about harmonization of a product. It's about economic convergence, right? So the market forces are enormous, right? And so add to that this privatization is happening. I mean, it's affecting what's going on in Europe, but in countries in Africa where state institutions are weak, I mean, the only way you can check for corruption is having institutional constraints. And even in America, it doesn't work. Look at Chuck Blazer, right? I mean, you know, I mean, that was just extraordinary, you know?
Right.
So
but you see situations where the rest of these countries are seemingly getting by with the corruption that is occurring there. But like, I think we can honestly say that development of the sport on the continent is directly being hindered by the fact that resources are not getting where they're supposed to, right? Is that fair?
I don't do Afro-pessimist narratives, but I'll grant you that there's I'll grant you that there's quite a bit of corruption. I would say corruption is checked.
I'm not going to be this nice.
I would say corruption is checked through institution building, institutional constraints. And I would say, just to close on, I guess, look at the role of protest on the continent, protest for better institutions, for freedom, for accountability, and how it plays out in football, right? I mean, from the chants of the stadia of Morocco and Algeria, which often operate better than political parties, right? Because the political parties are co-opted, you get social movements channeled into the stadia. But I would say the activism that you're seeing in women's football today is incredible, right? Against corruption, against pay inequity, against homophobia. Ghana, Nigeria, right? Players being persecuted because they're accused of being queer or whatever, right? Likewise, in Sudan, right? So they have to deal, I mean, in a number of countries, if Uganda passes an anti-gay law, it'll affect, obviously, it'll play out in different sectors of society. But look at Ghana and Nigeria, how players are mobilizing against these laws. From conservative evangelicals, but also from Islamic organizations. So look at, I would recommend, there's a good documentary about Sudan called Khartoum Offside, which is about women trying to contest a religious ban, right? An edict from religious establishment against women playing football, right? And then Bashir is toppled and football gets caught up in the revolution and so on. And so football is part of its policy, its culture, its mobilization. So I would say better take that perspective rather than across the continent, you know, there's rampant corruption. I mean, the corruption is for reasons of weak state capacity, weak institutions, and so on.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I'll add. Let me just. I want to just quickly say something, and I think you said it yourself today, which is that these things are. There's more than meets the eye. I mean, there's really good journalism from a publication called Josimar. It's, if you know your football again, Josimar, 86 World Cup, kind of, I would call him like, you know, that sort of like attacking the wing back. And he scored a great goal against, of all people, I think it was Northern Ireland. This tells me how such a sad figure I am that I know all that stuff. But in any case, if you read something like that magazine, you'll there's good journalism by this guy called Philippe Auclair. He's like a French guy, and he's written a lot about how if people thought when Sepp Blatter got, you know, moved out of as president of FIFA, and with that they think that's where the corruption ended. Under Infantino, I mean, he looks at the relationships between Infantino and the people who run CAF, and I don't want to, you know, mangle the detail, but I will just recommend go read like just about the levels of corruption, the very unequal relationship between CAF and FIFA, that some aspects of FIFA is run by, some aspects of CAF, sorry, are run by FIFA. Secondly, the people to Hisham's point about sort of like football is, for all that stuff I said, the idealism of football and the stuff that we put onto football, it's a capitalist enterprise. So the president of CAF is a South African billionaire called Patrice Motsepe. This guy, I mean, he's a businessman. There's no, some of the things, he's a big, he basically wants to implement a super league. The super league that everybody is fighting in Europe, he's trying to implement the super league. And again, which are the clubs that are going to mostly benefit from this? Moroccan, Algerian, South African, Egyptian. That's like the super clubs. They can, and Simba from Tanzania, which is a great club if people want to Google them. Brilliant club. So with like you should see there. People talk about parades. Go just Google Simba as parades after they come back from Champions League games. I mean, it will buy like on Instagram or whatever social media. But my point is just there's this sort of like, you know, kind of conventional tale, which is like this. It's kind of national corruption. And again, nobody says the reason. I mean, the president of the Ghanaian FA, I think he got caught in a sting. At one point, they had to like suspend the president of the Nigerian FA over corruption. I mean, you know, these things are real. They're not. We're not pretending that they're not there. But it is also true that a lot of the stuff is coming out more and more because, and I won't repeat everything. You know, not going to. Hisham, I think, laid it out very well. Because African footballers, people involved in football and sport in general, are becoming more organized. They're demanding more from the game. I also think there's even CAF reluctantly had to realize they had to invest more in the game to make the way that football is run more efficient. I mean, the performance of the African teams at the last World Cup, and we know now the story of Morocco, but it's also true that like all the coaches were African. There was a lot of investment by Senegal in how they were running their FA, how they were running their national team. So some of those things are changing. But you are correct. There are structural impediments that are sometimes to do with the actions of certain agents, i.e., football administrators, government ministries. Those things are related to it. But I also think that what I think people are fighting for is to say, like, it's our game. We don't want to be an embarrassment every time there's a World Cup.
Yeah.
That's over. We would like to win this thing now. And I think this kind of story around football in Morocco suggests, like, hey, if you organize it well, and if there's a commitment, then actually, hey, we could actually pull this off.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a wonderful message to try to close on. And I really want to emphasize this idea of Afro pessimism, which I haven't really I've called it such before. And I think it's so important. And I think it really does speak to the power of narratives when we talk about these things, why it's easier for me to believe that this is the result of African corruption rather than systemic in FIFA and rather institutional. But gentlemen, thank you so much for your help with this. I think there are a lot of different avenues with this that we maybe didn't get to cover in the time that we had. But before we go, I would want to ask from both of you if we could close on this. It does seem we've discussed a lot of challenges, but it does seem like the overwhelming sentiment is that there is just a ton of promise in African football, right? Both from a talent perspective, it's clearly there. From a love perspective, it's clearly there. From a fan perspective, it's clearly there. And I wonder if you had to identify what you think would be most important in actualizing a lot of this stuff. So going from promise to reality, what avenues or areas of challenges that we currently face do you think would be most consequential to moving the needle on those things this week? We can start with you, Sean, if you think you're ready to go.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah. Look, I just sounded poetic and football as protest and ideal and so on. But at the same time, I try to look at football as policy, right? And policy happens at the intersection of internal forces and external forces, right? And once if Nigeria can negotiate, right, and leverage concessions from the World Bank and the IMF, right, or from China, and play them off against each other in economic policy, you should be able to do that in football as well, right? One thing we haven't spoken about is China's stadium policy, right? So China comes, as opposed to the West that says, hey, I will give you a loan if you do this, that, privatize this, that, right? China shows up and says, okay, Angola, we'll build highways for you and you can pay us in kind. What you got? Oil, yeah. Whatever, right? So now they're building stadia, right? So I think we should be able to play off the French and the Germans and so on against a rising Asia, because China, there's a long story in today's time on how much money China is putting into football, right? And it hasn't failed because of corruption, by the way. Money has been siphoned off. But they understand the role of sports diplomacy, football and globalization, and they're seeing how a country like Qatar can own BAIN and host a World Cup and rebrand itself and so on. So China's getting on the game. So I think one thing in Africa is, in addition to building institutions domestically and academies and so on, is playing off the great powers when it comes to football, right? And a final thing to say is what I find beautiful. We study conflict, we study inequality, and I just find it really extraordinary that areas that are war-torn, conflict-ridden, as soon as a modicum of peace begins to appear, the kickabouts in the football begins. Right? It's sort of one of the first things to sprout as soon as you have a ceasefire. I find that just incredible on the continent, whether it's the Algerian Civil War or Mauritania or Mali. this rough and tumble football comes out, and the kids are kicking around and doing whatever, pretending to be Sadio and so.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important. And Sean, if you want to jump in as well, and if you could add any aspects of the conversation that you thought might have been important to touch on that we might have missed in our talks.
I mean, so the thing I want to quickly, the last thing I actually want to say, which is less about kind of something I'd like to see and something that I think is happening, but maybe people are not paying attention to it. And this is one of the interesting for me is to see what's happening with African football. One is, for example, the kind of the equivalent of like the Super Cup, the final for that game between the team that won the African Champions League and the one who won like the equivalent of the Europa League, that was played in Qatar.
Yeah, the Club World Cup.
I find that, I mean, we see that with like, the Serie A final gets played in Saudi, the Clasico was played in Saudi, et cetera, et cetera. We see that happening already. But I think it's interesting that you have now, as a regular thing, the African Super Cup is played in Qatar. The second one is, it's terrible to think this, but I can imagine the AFCON played in Qatar. I don't know why I think this.
I can see it.
I can see the AFCON being. I'm sort of just throwing that out. I think there's a larger conversation here about the move. It's like where does the power of football is moving? Money. Who's going to control football? The Europeans are in decline. They don't have the same pool. Well, their own clubs, like the Premier League, we're the best, we're the richest clubs in the Premier League these days.
Yeah, Man United is on the
Man United is on the block. So I think, to Hisham's point about I was in a thing last night where people talked about changing geopolitical stuff, and they said it was about Walter Rodney. It was this new film about Walter Rodney, which if it comes widely available, I recommend people should watch it. It's called Walter Rodney, What They Don't Want You to Know. It's made by this Indian British filmmaker. It just came out. I just saw it at NYU last night. But the point I was going to make is, like, somebody said, like, what's happening with in this kind of new geopolitical environment with the Chinese, to Hisham's point. I think we should think about, Africa should think about its relationship with the Gulf, etc., in some of these same terms, in this competition, this kind of push and pull, and how to leverage these relationships. I think is going to become interesting. So I wouldn't be surprised there's something else also here about, like, they have the capacity to host these tournaments at like short notice. When there was pandemic, the World Cricket Tournament was played there, the qualifiers for the Australian Open. I mean, it's interesting how this is sort of quietly happening. And I'm just sort of feeling it's an interesting development.
No, very, very much so. And I do think it's interesting that you both kind of see a future of world football that is more competitive than collaborative, so to speak. But I think that's maybe its own.
Well, collaborative from the rest of the world against Europe. Against you vote. FIFA, what people forget is, like, FIFA, every country has one vote. The Europeans hate that, and they keep adding. They make more new countries. It's not really new countries, but they just like how countries places within countries have a vote on FIFA, so they can. I think they're trying to keep the balance, because they're realizing Africa has like 54, 55. Yeah. Asia has like 56. As blocks, you can. I think there's some. I think they're so mad that these things are changing, and I'm surprised that Africans and Asians haven't really picked up on this. They're like, hey, these power imbalances, sport is a way to kind of compete better in these power imbalances.
Well, I think my gamble is that you're not going to be able to develop sovereign entities quite quickly enough to counter Africa. So we'll bank on that for right now. But gentlemen, thank you both so much for this. This has been a really interesting discussion. I don't think we could have done it without you. So thanks so much. Please follow. I don't know if you have your socials in the chat, but please find them online, follow their work. both of you. I want to thank you both again. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you for future programming in the future. For everyone in the audience, thanks for joining us tonight. I appreciate your time and your thoughtful questions, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you both.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Thank you, Teju.
All
Are we
right,
still recording? We're still on air?
I think so.
Sean, did you you saw this film yesterday at NYU?
Yeah, this I should have texted people about it. It was organized by Bhakti, you know Bhakti? Radical Books.
Warscapes?
Warscapes,
Yeah.
yeah. So they do a reading group and they read his decolonial. There's this new book called Decolonial Marxism.
Home isn't just where we're from.
Wait, are they playing that for a crowd?
It's the sounds that move us. The stories that shape us. And the flavors that heal us. It's the communities that connect us. The ones that hold us down. The ones that raise us up. Home is a feeling we all know. So if you're looking for it, you can always find it here. The Africa Center. Home is here.
Are we unmuted? Are we done? What's going on?
Yeah, we are very much still live. I think you guys can just log off and I will reach out to you over email in a second.
Okay, Tunde, thank you.